Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar regarding the 2-year anniversary of PURA's Equitable Modern Grid Initiative. My name is Marissa Gillett, and if I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you yet, I'm so pleased that you're able to join us this morning so that we can talk through these important and exciting updates as we approach the 2-year anniversary of our Grid Mod initiative. So next slide, please. The agenda for this morning is as follows. We are going to review the vision for the Equitable Modern Grid Initiative and talk through some of the objectives as a way to level set for those who are new, and as a reminder to those who have been involved in this since the beginning, as the objectives and the vision are really meant to guide not only the 11 tracks that are encompassed in this initiative, but also PURA's work moving forward. We also have an important update from members of the leadership team, the Energy and Technology Committee. We're fortunate today to have Representative David Rconti with us. I also believe we have Senator Norm Needleman joining, and I know we have other members and representatives from the ENT Committee and our other colleagues from the legislature. So we thank them and welcome them to today's webinar as well. Following that, I'm going to turn to two of PURA's key staff working on the grid initiative. First, turning to Director Josh Ryer to provide an update on the storage program, followed by Supervisor Stephanie Cohane to talk through updates with respect to the light duty fleet portion of our electric vehicle charging program. Then we will, as everyone knows, we have additional tracks, 9 to be exact, following those two. So we'd like to update everyone on some of the milestones that we've achieved and some of the milestones in the very near future for those dockets before providing a glimpse into what's set for us to work on next. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we are rapidly approaching the 2-year, actually we are 2 weeks past the 2-year anniversary of our Grid Mod initiative. It seems like just yesterday, especially since this largely coincided with me taking the position here in Connecticut. But as everyone knows, 2 years ago, on October 2nd, we issued our framework announcing the 11 initial tracks that we would be tackling through the Equitable Modern Grid Initiative. That document remains relevant today, and if you haven't had a chance to review it, or the materials that go with it, I think it's a great primer. It was really our attempt to lay out the vision and the objectives for each of those tracks. And I'd encourage you to read that today as a refresher for where we've been and where we're going. In that document, we outlined those 11 tracks as opportunities that we could tackle to modernize our grid. There are many barriers, as all of you know, to achieving this. And through that document, we outlined what we thought were the initial barriers, as well as some potential opportunities for overcoming those barriers. And that has really served as a guiding framework for how we have approached Grid Mod. And as you know, we are not the first state, by far, we are not the first state in the country to have approached grid modernization. Grid mod is a topic that states across the country and really across the world are going to need to grapple with as our infrastructure continues to age, while we also continue to rely to an increasing degree on our electric infrastructure to meet our daily needs. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So while not being the first state to approach grid mod, we did feel that it was imperative and really crucial for us to be thoughtful about how we approached grid mod. We are fortunate to have a number of stakeholders who remain actively engaged today between our electric distribution companies and our state agencies. However, we wanted to expand this to what we call non-traditional stakeholders. Equity is an important lens that we approach this process with. And while I think as an industry, we are starting to do a better job about thinking about equitable outcomes, what I think we need to do more of is think about how we inject equity into the process of developing in pursuing those initiatives. It may seem like a common sense observation, but I really think and believe strongly that you can't have an equitable outcome if you haven't had an equitable access to developing that outcome. And so we put a lot of time and thought into approaching grid mod from that lens. Specifically, in addition to trying to break down barriers for how non-traditional stakeholders can access and participate in our process, we've also tried to get out into the community and do listening sessions. Obviously, we've been a little bit stunted in our ability to do that because of the pandemic. However, we're reaching out to you today through Zoom, and that's been a very good tool for us. And we're looking forward to combining both virtual and in-person listening sessions in more of our dockets moving forward. We've also been very fortunate to work across our executive and legislative branches to make sure that we're being responsive to both their needs and also understanding what they are doing in their day-to-day initiatives, because there's so much more overlap between our agencies and the legislators on a day-to-day basis than one could imagine. Finally, we created the Office of Education Outreach and Enforcement, whom many of you have finally got to know as the Office of EOE. And they are available on a day-to-day basis, particularly to ease the connection between non-traditional stakeholders and PURA processes. Additionally, we have focused on cultivating actionable data to make sure that these non-traditional stakeholders can participate, because access to data we feel is crucial. It's not just enough for us to open up the processes so that people can participate, but once they're there, you have to make sure that there's a level playing field, most notably through the provision of actionable data. And finally, all of this is in very real recognition of the concept of stakeholder fatigue. There are folks, especially as we're trying to attract non-traditional stakeholders, we're often looking at communities and people who give a lot, not just in their professional lives, but in their personal lives as well. And we are cognizant that this process is another ask of your time, particularly for organizations who may not be have the funds or expertise to participate in programs like this. So in exchange for your time, we are trying very hard to demonstrate that there is a return on your investment of that time. So we're committed to providing timelines, sticking to them, and then providing the outcome. And if you, most importantly, if you feel that we haven't reached the outcome you were hoping for, we are striving to make sure that the decision is understandable, so you know why we have reached the decision that we have. So if we can go to the next slide, or apologize. So before I go to the next slide, I want to touch on, if you're new to PURA or processes, please make sure that you take advantage of these increasing opportunities to engage, whether I like to think of this as a spectrum of possible engagements, whether it's a passive engagement, signing up for email alerts on our various dockets, all the way to the more active end of the spectrum, whether it's providing verbal comment at our public hearings or listening sessions, or providing written comments at any time by emailing those comments to the address on the screen. And again, finally, the most active end of the spectrum is formally intervening in our proceeding. And we've been very fortunate to have an increasing diversity of perspectives with stakeholders engaging in those proceedings. So next slide, please. So the objectives of the framework that we announced 2 years ago and have really been a guiding principle in each of the tracks that we've undergone. We want to take this opportunity to emphasize that these are objectives not just for the tracks and the proceedings that fall under the Equitable Modern Grid framework, They are objectives that we hope you see carried through to all of the dockets that PURA undertakes moving forward. We recognized from the outset that achieving each of these 4 objectives can sometimes seem in conflict with each other. And because of that, it takes being very intentional about those objectives. And we're using them as guiding principles for how we resolve different program design elements. All 4 of these objectives on the screen are inextricably connected, and no one objective can be accomplished without the others if we're going to truly realize an equitable modern grid. So the whole of the equitable modern grid, to our minds, is greater than the sum of its parts, and for that reason, we're very focused on these objectives. Before I turn this over to Chair Rconti, I want to take this opportunity to say it was important to us to have representatives from the legislature talk to you this morning, because I think that there have been some really strong examples of how the harmonious relationship between the legislature and a regulatory agency can work. The objectives that you see on the screen are derived from public policies and objectives that the legislature has adopted through various public acts. And Chair Rconti is going to talk to you about some of the objectives and one of those public acts in particular. We want to thank the legislature for their guidance. We think that pushing out the objectives that you want to see PURA adopt through a program is instrumental to helping us to design a cost-effective way to implement those policies. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Chair Rconti to make some remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Gillett, and everyone. You can see me okay and hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. And thanks for everybody for joining this webinar today. I took a quick look at the attendees list, and it's a great turnout. So I think we're going to accomplish a lot, not only through this docket, these proceedings, but also in the work that we do in the legislature. And I do just want to give a quick thank you to Chair Gillett, Commissioner Bukowski, and Commissioner Karen, and all of the staff attorneys and analysts, et cetera, over at PURA. We've put a lot of work on their plate over the last couple sessions, and they have done a great job of putting out these decisions in a very timely manner, which I'm sure everybody attending this webinar today also appreciates. And as the chair mentioned, we try to do our best on the committee, one, to work in a very strong bipartisan nature, and also work in collaboration with our regulators over at PURA. And I think the 2 best examples of that are one of the bills that our committee took the lead on this year, and that was our electric storage bill. I don't need to go into the merits, I think, of storage. Everyone on this webinar is very well versed. This bill set a lot of objectives and a very ambitious target to reach 1,000 megawatts of deployment by the end of 2030. And we became the 8th state in the country to issue an energy storage deployment target. And that created a lot of notoriety for Connecticut over the summer in various green and clean energy publications. And I think this bill in particular is a great example of how we as a committee and in the General Assembly can provide policy guidance to the regulators, which they then follow in a docket. And I think it also highlights the very important role that the Green Bank plays in the development of our green economy here in Connecticut. And I think another example of our collaboration is the new rate designs in the docket RE11. Earlier this year, we had sent a letter asking PURA to reconsider an earlier decision from 2014 where they changed the class 30 rates, and they came up with, I thought, with a good option, a volumetric rate 27 and rate 30 option that may provide timely economic relief for low demand small businesses customers. And I have gotten feedback from various small business owners that have been receiving letters from Eversource, letting them know about this new option that they have, which is part of our initiative. This docket is very innovative, and it also requires our committee to think creatively. We're looking at proposals that could potentially help fund advanced metering technology without more ratepayer burden. We're looking at more policy proposals that can enhance our storage goals. And, we've been working on having some bipartisan conversations on some hydrogen proposals, this year, which I think a lot of people on this call will be excited about. And I also think it's time that we make adjustments to our conservation and load management program. The decisions in this docket, are attracting new and innovative companies to our state. We have Cadenza Innovation here in Danbury, which is a battery company. I was able to take a tour and have a meeting with their CEO and an executive team earlier this summer. And they are working on some really groundbreaking stuff. And other companies like Utilidata that could help us advance our advanced metering technology goals. As the chair mentioned, we push out these objectives from the legislature while we're in session. So I also encourage everybody on this call to really participate in these dockets, in these proceedings. We do ask PURA to do these proceedings for a reason, and I do my best. And I know my colleagues on the Energy and Technology Committee do their best to follow public comments, to follow some of these decisions, to see what you as stakeholders are saying, in these proceedings, because we do take that as feedback for ourselves and try to craft legislation around that too. So I think I can speak for the whole committee that we're excited about this proceeding, and we look forward to continuing to support it in the way that we can. So thank you, Chair Marissa, thank you, Chair Gillett, for having me here today.
Thank you, Chair Rconti. Appreciate those remarks. And I can see that we already are starting to see questions come in through the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you can stick around, my guess is that some of those questions will be directed to you, which we do have. Speaking of that, we do have time for questions at the end of today's webinar. And PURA staff and myself are happy to stay on even past the 11 o'clock hour if there are additional questions. So please feel free to type those into the Q&A function at any time throughout the rest of this presentation, and we will get to as many as we can. So next slide, please. I'd like to turn the presentation over to Director Josh Ryer. Josh, who PURA is so fortunate to have, is the director of our Office of Utility Programs and Initiatives. This office is the main driver of our Equitable Modern Grid proceeding. All of these many dockets that you're going to hear both him and then Stephanie Cohane discuss today all come out of his shop, and that's in addition to the normal initiatives that PURA is tasked with. So I'm really excited for you to hear more about some of these programs, and I will turn it over to Josh, please.
Great. Well, thank you so much for those remarks, Chairman, and thank you, Representative Rconti and Chair Rconti, for your time this morning and for your support and the input from all of your colleagues at the legislature. So what I want to spend some time doing is going over kind of the key milestones that we've kind of achieved to date over the last 2 years. But where I want to start is actually with some level setting, and just to make sure everyone's familiar with the concepts that the chairman talked about earlier, that we actually outlined 11 what we called near-term topics. I think you could quibble over whether or not 2 to 3 years is near term, but we outlined 11 near-term topics that we were going to investigate to really effectuate and to accelerate our objectives, the 4 objectives that the chairman offered up, and also advancing the equitable modernization of Connecticut's grid. So the first series of dockets that we opened, again, back 2 years ago, sorry, were these 6 topics, starting with energy affordability, AMI, storage, zero emission vehicles, innovation pilots, and interconnection standards. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we've done in each of those as we go through the presentation today. And particularly myself and Stephanie Cohane, the supervisor of the Clean and Affordable Energy Unit, which really is taking on a lot of these dockets and helping to meet those deadlines that Representative Rconti outlined earlier. We'll get into deep dive conversations on electric storage and EVs. But so those were the first 6 topics that we identified and opened 2 years ago. The next 4 that we opened after that were on non-wires alternatives, resilience and reliability standards and programs, our DER analysis and program review, which I'll talk about in kind of a different light later, and then some of those new rate designs that Chair Rconti talked about earlier. And so again, I just wanted to bring those up so we can level set in terms of the near-term topics that we really tried to focus on over the last 2 years. But like the chairman said earlier, it doesn't really, the equitable modern grid really doesn't stop with those 11 topics. It really does bleed into the way of thinking about things, the objectives in terms of bringing the lens of equity and inclusivity into process and how we think about things. Even the dockets that we open really extends to a lot of the other work that my office and also Stephanie's unit within that office really focus on. And so I wanted to highlight some of those quickly. So you may have heard about the new residential and as well as the non-residential tariff programs that'll start next year. We also just authorized just yesterday, actually, the arrearage forgiveness programs for the next year going into the winter heating season. Also, all of these objectives and the same lens we took to kind of our thinking through in the electric distribution companies or EDCs response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then also emergency planning and response, including tropical storm Isaias. So it's more than just 11 topics. It's really a lot of the substantive and foundational work related to the electric distribution companies in Connecticut. We try and bring this lens to. So as promised, we'll start with kind of a deep dive on 2 of these dockets. The first is the electric storage program. And the first thing I want to highlight, and Chair Rconti did a great job of highlighting this earlier, is that really this is a perfect example of kind of a marrying of in coordination with not only the legislature, but other government agencies, including the Green Bank, who's actually going to help administer this program with the EDCs, but also with the EDC's existing programs. Some of you might have been familiar with Eversource's Connected Solutions program. So a lot of the elements that the Green Bank proposed, but also that existed in the EDCs, kind of now with this aspirational target of 1,000 megawatts by 2030, really helps solidify what this program became. So back on July 28th, PURA issued a final decision authorizing a 9-year program for a storage program that would start January 1st of this next year. So the deployment target, and for those that are familiar with Public Act 2153, there's kind of 2 sections in terms of how we'd get to 1,000 megawatts. The first authorized PURA to establish a program. And then the second was this kind of procurement process that could potentially be run out of deep. So really, we took a carve out of the 1,000 megawatt goal and said, okay, this program will achieve at least, and that's an important caveat, the at least part, 580 megawatts over that 9-year period. But we'll have 3-year cycles and annual program reviews to make sure that the incentive levels that are set are actually achieving those targets. And really, the incentive levels that I just referenced are twofold. The first is an upfront incentive program that will be administered by the Connecticut Green Bank And for those that are familiar with their work on programs, they've administered the residential solar investment program for the better part of the last decade. So we know their track record there. And then the EDCs will administer and really communicate with these storage devices on a performance-based incentive program that will pay storage facilities to operate at times that are actually most valuable to the grid and to all ratepayers. So in terms of the upfront incentive, there's a cap, as you see there, for both residential and C&I customers. And one of the really important things that I don't want to forget to mention about this program is it's unique. There's a couple of elements that are unique about this program for Connecticut that you don't see elsewhere across the country. And the first is that this actually covers not only residential customers, but commercial customers. And also, as you see kind of later in one of these bullet points, also front of the meter storage. And really here we're talking about what are called standalone storage facilities, and trying to incentivize and think about all of these different types of storage facilities, whether they're paired with solar, whether they're behind the meter with residential customers, behind the meter with C&I customers. It was really important for us to send not only the long-term market signal of a 9-year program, but that a market signal that we're interested in all of these different use cases for customers. And then the other thing that is particularly unique about this program is that there are targeted incentives, I guess is one way to say it, to maximize the resilience benefits of storage and what they can provide to not only to customers individually, but to the grid as a whole. And so, which of course, coming out of Tropical Storm Isaias and just more and more as we see the effects of climate change have become an increasingly important reason to deploy storage. So what will actually happen is for systems that are deployed on what's called the grid edge, and on poor performing feeders, so essentially where people experience outages more frequently and for longer durations, at critical facilities, also replacing old fossil generation, and then also for small businesses, they'll actually be able to monetize what are called the capacity rights, the wholesale energy capacity rights associated with storage that will provide an additional incentive on top of the upfront incentives and the performance-based incentive that I mentioned earlier. Also, the chairman talked about the importance of equity as a lens that we see all of these proceedings through. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with kind of the Biden administration's target of 40% of these programs targeting 40% of customers in LMI communities. And so one of the key elements of this program design was actually that the upfront incentive for customers located in low to moderate income communities that were really targeting deployment of 40% there. So we authorized some targeted marketing campaigns that the Green Bank will help lead, similar to what they've done in LMI communities for the RCIP program and solar programs in Connecticut. I already mentioned the front of the meter storage, and there's a new tariff that'll hopefully address some of the barriers currently to front of the meter or standalone storage that will go effect on January 1st of this upcoming year, along with the storage program that I just talked about. And then the last thing I want to mention before turning it over to Stephanie Cohane to talk about the EV charging program that we also authorized is that the Green Bank did some amazing work looking at what the cost benefit ratio is to not only the participants of this program, but also to the everyone else that's on the grid, the non-participants. And so it's really the first of its kind that I've seen in terms of getting into that level of depth and making sure that we understand what are the benefits not only to people that participate, but to everyone else. So it's really important for us as utility regulators to understand, okay, this is actually going to provide benefits to everyone that's on the grid, not just the people that are deploying these systems. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Stephanie Cohane. As I mentioned earlier, is the supervisor of our Clean and Affordable Energy Unit, who will talk you through our EV charging program that we authorized this summer as well. Stephanie?
Great, thanks Josh, and thanks everyone for being with us this morning to hear a multitude, as I'm sure you're gathering, of updates in PURA's Equitable Modern Grid Initiative. So as Josh mentioned, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the recent developments in our zero emission vehicles or EV charging program docket. So earlier this summer, the authority established a 9-year EV charging program, again, similar in terms of the structure of the storage program that Josh just outlined. So the EV charging program as well begins January 1st of next year. And at its core, it provides a combination of incentives for charging station infrastructure, as well as a few accompanying rate design offerings, which I'll get into in just a moment. And so really the objective of the program is to enable a self-sustaining zero emission vehicle or ZEV market in the state that not only supports Connecticut's commitment as part of this existing 10-state ZEV Memorandum of Understanding, but also to help the state achieve its existing greenhouse gas targets pursuant to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And transportation electrification is certainly a component of that. And so the EV charging program is part of an approach that stakeholders agree is necessary to realize these statewide objectives and to maximize the potential electric system benefits of EV deployment, as well as helping realize the economic, health, and environmental benefits that transportation electrification provides. So our EV charging program is structured based on the establishment of deployment targets for electric vehicle supply equipment, or EVSC, essentially just charging station infrastructure across 5 program areas or market segments. And those are listed here on the slide and are also just quickly looking at single family level 2 chargers at single family residences, as well as looking at level 2 infrastructure deployed or installed in multi-unit dwelling spaces. We have a segment and a specific targets for deployment of direct current fast chargers, or DCFCs, as well as public level 2 charging stations to supplement the existing infrastructure across the state, as well as a component on workplace for kind of employee focused charging, as well as light duty fleet charging that may have a combination of level 2 and or DCFC chargers available. So the key program elements consist of, as I mentioned, a combination of incentives for networked level 2 chargers, as well as DCFCs, and that networked is a key component, PURA feels, as part of the overall program design, and kind of looking forward and making sure that investments that we're making today are realized and recognized in the future. So the program adopts a make-ready model, which is used in other states as well. And essentially what that means is that the Eversource and UI will invest in the infrastructure required to enable charging from the distribution system to the EVSC, and we've established the decision established maximum incentives per site, so to kind of make sure we get the most money spread across the state as possible. There are also additional incentives available for sites hosting charging stations in underserved communities. Again, just looking at how we can, as equitably as possible, make sure that charging station infrastructure is being deployed across the state and not in just certain areas. So the program has established deployment targets, again, based on these 3-year program cycles that Josh outlined in terms of the storage context. So overall, the 9-year program aims to deploy more than 14,000 ports. This is for level 2 and DCFCs combined, as well as 50,000 level 2 chargers installed at single family residential homes. That's kind of what the incentive structure and deployment targets are based around. And to another kind of quickly component of the EV charging program is to mitigate potential negative impacts to the grid based on charging patterns. Single family residents, as well as light duty fleets that receive an incentive for networked level 2 or DCFC charging for non-public use. Both of those kind of use cases, if you will be required to enroll in a managed charging program. And so the utilities are leading a working group now to finalize kind of the managed charging program implementation details to submit to the authority. So just really quick on the rate design piece, at least in the near term, Eversource and UI will be offering tariffs specifically for separately metered EV charging stations to mitigate the impact of demand charges, especially in those DCFC charger use cases that may have low utilization rates in the early years. And so the utilities are kind of also simultaneously working to develop longer term solution to this demand charge barrier that we had heard many from the industry cite as in terms of getting greater widespread installation and deployment of these chargers. So a longer term solution, we've asked the utilities to take a look at something that kind of scales down volumetric charges down and demand charges up as charging station utilization increases over time. Again, to kind of not necessarily just be a static tariff. So very quickly, other features of the program worth noting is that the multi-unit dwelling, so site hosts at multi-unit dwellings have an option to lease. We'll have an option to lease utility-owned level 2 chargers. And again, that was brought forth as a recommendation from experience in other jurisdictions that there may be specific barriers in getting charging station infrastructure in the multi-unit dwelling space in general. And so the program allows for the initial ownership from the utility perspective. And then finally, last but certainly not least, PURA has retained the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI, who's conducting a study to identify how to best address and offer electrified transportation mobility options, specifically for low to moderate income communities, with the recognition and acknowledgement that community members may not have personal vehicles or be able to participate in either a purchase or leasing program of an electric vehicle, but still to make sure that the benefits of transportation electrification are shared among all those in Connecticut. So that study is being finalized in the coming months and will be kind of folded into our greater broader work on EVs to inform program design going forward. With that, I will turn it back to Josh. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Stephanie. Great, so after those two deep dives, we want to give you a sense of some of the other key milestones and some of the other dockets that I highlighted when I started my comments. So the first one that it actually might seem like a trivial update, but is actually a sign that the process is working. So our docket RU6 is about interconnection standards, and we actually issued the final decision around this time last year, and it stood up two working groups that started this calendar year, a technical working group and a policy working group. For those of you that are familiar with interconnection issues and kind of ISO transmission level interconnection issues that have occurred in Massachusetts, and kind of the technical and policy working groups that other states have stood up, really not only is this kind of a best practice, but it's a great way for Connecticut to get out and ahead of those issues and to try and come up with solutions and get those solutions in place before we get to the same place that unfortunately Massachusetts in some areas finds itself in, where with renewable energy generation unable to connect until they figure out exactly what the transmission system needs and what the impact will be. So the update here is actually that we, the decisional staff at PURA, my office, received our first motion from EOE, which is the office that Chairman Gillett mentioned earlier, that actually can engage directly with stakeholders. They're the ones that are actually helping facilitate those working groups. And so we received our first motion from the working groups to approve some changes that hopefully will address some of the issues that have come up in the working groups. So again, it seems like a minor thing. A motion is just requesting decisional staff at PURA to change something, but really, again, it's showing that the process that we've already put in place is beginning to work. Moving on to AMI, our REO2 track of grid mod. So we opened that again 2 years ago. We've had various discussions and discovery in that docket, but we just issued a straw proposal that really set out PURA's thinking about AMI, a statewide deployment of AMI on August 17th of this year. And we requested that the EDCs amend their plans that they had actually submitted last year for a statewide deployment. And we also then recently have requested stakeholder comment to talk about and to provide input on how exactly they think that the utilities or electric distribution companies or EDCs should recover the costs associated with AMI and also the benefits that are associated with it. One of the things about kind of where we're at in the AMI process is that we have the benefit of learning from roughly half of the states in the country. I believe deployment on a end use basis is about 50% nationally, and a lot of that came after and was able to take advantage of the ARA funding that was available at the end of the 2020s. And so we're able to learn from a lot of those experiences. And one of the things that we learned was that while all of the studies or a lot of the studies show that AMI can and should be cost beneficial, it's really about making sure that customers benefit not only immediately, but are getting all of the benefits out of AMI. So that's what the straw proposal really walked through and why we requested the EDCs to revise and provide that updated AMI deployment plan by November 5th. Also, I mentioned earlier the arrearage forgiveness programs and the decision that came out yesterday in what's not a grid mod docket, but a grid mod adjacent docket, I guess I'd say, out of Stephanie's unit, docket 210701. Those programs, at least that decision, largely covered the period that's the kind of the winter moratorium, shutoff moratorium for hardship customers starting November 1st. So that's why the program is 2021 through 2022. And why I highlight that here is, again, it's a really important example of the grid mod dockets. And as you might remember, REO1 in grid mod was energy affordability. In that docket, we authorized a series of actually 4 tracks, or what we called 100-day sprints, where folks, PURA staff engaged directly with stakeholders, provided reports to PURA, and then PURA issued findings and different changes. And so all of really yesterday's decision incorporated a lot of that feedback along with our learnings from the COVID-19 response, and put that into effect, a lot of those learnings into effect in the decision, again, that was issued yesterday. And the slides that I know we'll have available for folks after this, the last slide actually has all of the relevant decisions from the sprint tracks out of our energy affordability docket for those that are interested of kind of where some of these changes and enhanced communication measures really came from. And then the last one I want to highlight before passing it back to Chairman Gillett is our non-wires alternative docket 171203 REO7. At the end of July this year, we issued a straw proposal on what that might look like. And just to set some context, so when we say non-wires alternatives, what we're really talking about is alternatives to traditional poles and wires solutions that would address the same need on the distribution system. So if a transformer needs to be upgraded, the transformers you can see out your window, if one of those, or frankly be a larger one, needed to be upgraded, is there an alternative like solar plus storage, like storage plus demand response, that actually would more cost effectively meet those needs and also provide greater societal benefits through deploying those? So really this docket is looking at understanding and setting up a process to be able to evaluate those opportunities, because frankly, we're continuing to see the cost declines across all of these new technologies, including fuel cells, solar, and battery storage. So how do we make sure we're set up to take advantage of those continuing cost declines and provide those benefits to ratepayers as an alternative? And so we've held a technical meeting to date on that, and so more to come there. Stakeholders should look out for that. And then the last thing I'd say on this docket and a few of the other ones, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that in addition to Stephanie's unit, we have another unit within my office, the Reliability, Security, and Resilience unit, that the NWA docket, RU8 that we talked about, and many of the other dockets that we've talked about today, that they're actually helping advance as well. So they've been an integral part of achieving this success to date. So with that, Chairman, I will turn it back to you to give the last updates.
Thank you, Director Ryer. If we can go to the next slide, I'm going to start to bring us home before turning to questions that we've received throughout this presentation. So I want to start with updates on the last two tracks of grid mod that we haven't had a chance to talk through yet today, starting with the innovation pilot framework. If you've had a chance to meet me or hear me speak before, I think you've probably heard me rail to some degree against pilots. I'm not a fan. I think that we are generally past the point of piloting things in our society and needing to move toward action. However, what we're talking about here in terms of using the word pilot is we want to be very intentional generating innovative solutions that can be scaled. So it's okay in our opinions, in our collective opinion, to pilot. Indeed, we should be encouraging some innovation as we have no shortage of issues that are ripe for an innovative solution. But the process that we're setting up through REO5 and is outlined in this innovation framework is meant to encourage that innovation, but under a fail fast mentality. So what I mean by that is if it's going to fail, want to fail fast so that we can both minimize ratepayer exposure, but also if it's not failing fast, that means that it's hopefully ready for scalability. And we think that the framework that's being set up through this docket can accomplish that. For those of you that are familiar with New York's version of grid mod, they have a program there called Rconti. It's something comparable to what we're trying to accomplish through REO5. You can think about this as a regulatory sandbox. And I'm sure there are other metaphors out there. So we've issued a straw proposal. We've had a stakeholder workshop where we are fortunate to receive a lot of constructive feedback. And next up is a stakeholder workshop in just about a week and a half. So we're really looking forward to, we're endeavoring to reach a final decision in this docket by the end of this year, which means that we could stand up the process and start seeking innovative solutions as early as next year. This could be a great docket for moving additional things forward that we've explored in some of the other equitable modern grid tracks, but not yet had a chance to sink our teeth into. For example, some of the things that are starting to come out of the RMI study, for example, are things like the topics of microtransit, e-bikes or e-scooters and things like that. Can we start looking at those additional topics and think through whether those are right for piloting through this regulatory sandbox? I think we can, and I'm excited for folks to participate there. It's also given us an opportunity to work with our sister agencies or quasi-public agencies. We've got a great team over the Connecticut Green Bank, as well as Connecticut Innovations. If you're not familiar with these outfits, I really encourage you to get acquainted with them. Connecticut Innovations is like our own state-based venture capital firm, and I'm really excited to partner with them and bring innovation to the electric grid space. Another track that we haven't had a chance to talk about today is our reliability and resilience track. This one is very near and dear to my heart. We had to pause it while we completed the tropical storm Isaias investigation, as we assumed there would be critical lessons learned through that investigation, and there were. We also received some additional helpful guidance from our colleagues at the legislature through the Take Back Our Grid Act that provided additional guidance that we're incorporating into this track. We've had a few kickoff technical meetings that I think have been really eye-opening for both us as well as our stakeholders. And I'm really looking forward to digging into this docket over the next year. This has also been an opportunity for us to incorporate some feedback and interest from non-traditional stakeholders, including individual ratepayers. There's a lot of interest these days in vegetation management. It's cropping up all over the place. I think that was a bad pun. But we are taking this opportunity to think more holistically and evaluate even things, taking it all the way back to the cost benefit framework and thinking through things not just in terms of the cost of a one-time fix of putting up a pole and wire, but also trying to think about it from the perspective of a cost benefit framework that takes into account the increasing frequency of climate change events. So we are really excited and enlightened by that non-traditional stakeholder engagement, and we're looking for additional opportunities to bring that in. That includes, in case you've missed it, a request for written comments regarding some of the enhancements to the emergency response plans that our electric distribution companies have made at our direction following the tropical storm ECAS investigation. So we've linked that here and are particularly interested in feedback from municipalities about some of the enhancements to the communications protocols. And those comments are due November 10th. So if you can move to the next slide, please. In conclusion, we just want to highlight a few additional things to come. Most notably, and it feels in some ways like the Equitable Modern Grid has been a big dress rehearsal for performance-based regulation. And I think that they're very go hand in hand with each other, and we're excited to build off of this progress. Governor Lamont and the leadership of the ENT committee, this is a bipartisan bill, the Public Act 20-5, or more commonly known as the Take Back Our Grid Act. It provided instruction to PURA to undertake a transition from traditional cost of service regulation to performance-based regulation. So we are in the process of finalizing staffing. So if you have anyone interested in being part of this transitional opportunity, please encourage them to keep an eye out for opportunities to join PURA staff. So after we finish finalizing our staff, we will be announcing additional procedural steps because as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we feel very strongly that providing timeline insight into both the steps and our objectives leads to constructive stakeholder engagement. But this is going to be a multi-year effort, so we want folks to prepare accordingly. And there's also already been a lot of work. We've noticed, there are organizations like Boat Solar and Operation Fuel and Save the Sound. A lot of folks are thinking already about constructive feedback that they'll be able to provide us through this docket. And we really applaud those efforts and thank you for convening them. In conclusion, why we think this matters and why we're going to continue to plug away. We think that it is critical that utilities incentives are aligned with the public interest, public policy goals, and most importantly, with improved outcomes for ratepayers moving forward. The programs that we're standing up, the programs and processes that we're standing up through the Equitable Modern Grid proceeding are designed to provide long-term price signals so that we can both attract and retain interest and jobs and improved outcomes for the state of Connecticut. We're striving to be a leader in building a process that can be replicated elsewhere. And we're borrowing heavily from best practices that have come before us. So in closing, before we turn to the Q&A portion of today's proceeding, I want to thank my staff at PURA for their efforts over the last 2 years that I've been here. Not only my fabulous team members that we featured here today, Josh and Stephanie, and the half a dozen or so staff that work on grid mod initiatives day in and day out, including the other supervisor within Josh's unit, Steve Capozzi, but also the rest of PURA staff, including our dedicated legislative and communications liaisons. As you might be able to imagine, an initiative like the Equitable Modern Grid is really all-encompassing. It requires a shift of not just the culture and way of thinking, but also how we prioritize work that is assigned to PURA by statute. Our day jobs haven't gone away. So in many ways, I've asked the same staff with the same resources to take on twice the workload. You know, their priorities and deliverables have been shifted. And the fact that we've accomplished so much in 2 years when we have personal and professional impacts to our lives from COVID and the tropical storm and the ever shifting conversation about rates, I think is really commendable. And I cannot emphasize enough how proud I am to be leading PURA. So thank you for your attention and for participating today. I apologize that we're at the top of the hour. If you're interested in sticking with us, we're going to turn to questions and answers. If you have to leave, no problem. We are going to make the recording and the slides available on our website after today's meeting. Thank you for attending, and I'm going to turn now to the Q&A. So the first couple of questions that we received were all the way back during the portion of the presentation where we were visited by Chair Rconti, and Senator Nealman has also joined us. So maybe I'll first pose this to the good chairs. Questions have come in about whether the ENT co-chairs intend to introduce support energy affordability. Like, what legislation are you looking to introduce this coming session that might help the transition to renewable energy and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? So Chair Rconti, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Thanks, Marissa. And affordability is always at the top of my mind, especially since last summer in particular. You know, the United Way out here in Danbury issued their annual ALICE report, and it shows how much people are struggling to pay just monthly bills, utilities included. And that's why a big piece of, there's a big LMI piece in our storage bill this past session. So, you know, and I'll be having some meetings with some regional renewable energy stakeholders to discuss various ways we can take advantage and further strengthen our storage program and statutes in utilizing storage and how to replace fossil fuel peaker plants, to Alex's question. And, you know, DEEP does still have a decent amount of grid scale procurement authority. You know, the legislation that we passed in 2019, you know, authorized 2,000 megawatts of offshore wind procurement authority. DEEP utilized and awarded 800 megawatts of that to Avant-Garde Renewables, which they are now named, I believe. So with the remaining 1,200, you know, should we consider legislation, and I'm kind of posing this question, you know, as I'm talking, you know, should we amend those statutes to require that the rest of that procurement be paired with storage as part of the RFP? I'd be interested to hear sort of feedback from the various stakeholders that are still on, you know, on that. Everyone I know here has my email, is not shy about reaching out. You know, and I also think we can adjust, we can still do rate making reform. You know, I think the revenue decoupling mechanism right now is still way too advantageous to the utility. And I think that is ripe for reform. You know, I think various regional programs could be taken advantage of to return dividends to ratepayers. Because to your question, Alex, you know, we need to make our grid more reliable, more resilient, and cleaner. But constituents, ratepayers of Connecticut are feeling the pinch. I get reached out to weekly from my constituents, on that. While they support all of our initiatives and they believe that we should be taking the action we're taking, it comes at a cost. And I think the biggest utility in our state needs to work with us a little more on playing those costs, and helping shift some of that burden away from ratepayers to their shareholders. Still not satisfied with how that is weighed out right now, and that's going to be something I'm going to continue to work on in my time in the legislature.
Thank you, Representative Rconti. Don't go anywhere, because I think you had another question about whether you're interested in elaborating or commenting on the hydrogen legislation that you referenced in your opening remarks. Is it too soon to get into that?
Yeah, a little too soon. I just wanted, the goal of mentioning it was sort of to get that reaction. I wanted to tease it to everybody because it's still only October. I don't have drafts yet. We're still kind of meeting with stakeholders, doing our due diligence. But I did want to tease it for everybody to let everybody know that, I expect that to be a proposal the committee puts out there in the upcoming session.
Thank you, sir. So speaking of hydrogen and the overlap to the natural, I'll use that as a segue into a question about natural gas. We received a question about how PURA is thinking about the natural gas expansion program and whether that fits into the objectives of a modern and equitable grid. And I really appreciate this question. As you've probably gathered from the presentation today, most of the updates that we've been focusing on in the initial round of the grid modernization proceeding are focused specifically on the electric sector. However, the objectives are meant to transcend into the other sectors. Part of grid mod and the way that we're trying to change our thinking within PURA is thinking about the system and ratepayers and we were trying to think of this as a whole system. So clearly the natural gas expansion program is ripe for consideration in light of those objectives. I would refer folks to we have an open proceeding 210824 which was opened just two short months ago, where we've announced that we are investigating through phase 2 of that proceeding the appropriateness of the natural gas expansion program. So I have to reserve further comment because that is an open and active proceeding. But if anyone is interested in engaging in that proceeding, we would very much encourage you to do so. And again, the docket is 210824. So next, we received a series of questions regarding energy storage. And I'm going to turn to Director Ryer to try to address these questions kind of in a swath. And perhaps with respect to the first question that came in, we have a question about scalability of the caps with the residential and commercial allocations under the battery storage legislation. I'd love to hear Director Ryer touch on the program design flexibility that we've built into that program, and then see if we can touch on answers to some of these other storage questions that came in at the same time. So Director Ryer?
Yeah, absolutely happy to. So I mentioned briefly, and that's always the difficulty with an hour for updates like this, right? You gloss over some of the more important details on some of the specific programs. So I'm both Stephanie and myself mentioned that a key element of the program design, not only for the storage program, but for the EV charging infrastructure program, are these annual program reviews in program cycles. And frankly, that's something that the energy efficiency world does often. Most states that have energy efficiency programs have review cycles. So just borrowing best practices there. But so we actually carved out, so I mentioned it was a 9-year program. We carved out deployment targets for 3-year cycles. So for example, the deployment target for the first 3-year target for residential customers is 50 megawatts, and for C&I customers is 50 megawatts. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't actually exceed that. But what it does mean is that that's the goal for the first program cycle, and that annually in our reviews, we will be looking very closely, and actually we've instituted across all of our renewable energy programs, the new tariffs that I mentioned earlier, as well as the storage and EV program that we talked about today, annual review dockets that will be opened in August of every year to not only evaluate, to get key data metrics, to the chairman's earlier point, that will be available to all customers, so folks can do their homework on that as well. And so that'll be open to everyone. But then also for us to evaluate, okay, are we hitting our deployment targets? Are the incentives sufficient? Are we doing more than we targeted? And is that what we're looking to do? Does that make sense? And as well as making sure the cost benefit that I talked about earlier is still on track, and additionally making sure that we're hitting our LMI deployment targets. So that's kind of to the chairman's point on scalability. We have a 9-year program and the aspirational targets, but then we also have carved out these smaller chunks to make sure that we're monitoring our progress along the way. Now, another important thing to note is the 580 that I mentioned earlier is just for behind the meter residential and behind the meter commercial systems. Obviously, as I mentioned, this program is trying to encourage and will continue to look at ways to encourage other types of storage, including front of the meter and standalone systems. So anything that is achieved beyond the 580 through front of the meter systems would actually be in addition to the 580. So hopefully that addresses the scalability question. I think a number of the questions that I was looking through in the Q&A section got at kind of program administration. Where should customers be looking? So I mentioned earlier that the Connecticut Green Bank will be administering the program with the EDCs. They're just with this program design, it makes a lot of sense for there to be kind of a partnership between the two here. So we're actually we've already opened that series of annual dockets that I mentioned a second ago. We've opened that for all of our existing programs and future programs already. And so the docket for the storage program is 210805. And actually tomorrow, the Green Bank will be submitting most of the last of the kind of key program documents to make sure that everything's in order to then go into effect January 1 of next year. So those will then go through a review process at PURA stakeholders, and we encourage all stakeholders that are interested to take a look at those. Folks will have 2 weeks to respond to those submissions, and then we'll review them and make our final determination on what the program will look like. But the simple answer to one of the questions in terms of where should customers go starting January 1 is yes, the Green Bank. Folks should reach out and look for a dedicated program website to work through.
Thank you, Director Ryer. And if I could ask my fellow panelists to, if there are any questions that can be answered by typing them in, if you wouldn't mind scrolling through. But a few of these questions deserve a longer answer. So let me next turn to you, Stephanie Cohen. I think we received a question during the EV portion of the presentation regarding, it would be helpful if you could clarify for folks whether municipal utilities, I apologize, when I read this question the first time, I think I misconstrued it. I thought the question was, are municipalities eligible for the incentives that we've discussed today? Perhaps you can clarify that, and we can circle back to the question if that's not answering it.
Sure. So in terms of eligibility for the incentives, we've structured it as the site host is eligible for the incentive, and we'll work with the program administrators, which in this case is Eversource in their service territory or UI in their service territory. So more information to come from the utility specifically on how to access these incentive programs. But to answer directly, municipalities can be considered as a site host and therefore would be eligible based on the different types of chargers going in, where it's going in. If it's in an underserved community, there's potentially additional funding or incentives available to offset the costs of the infrastructure investment there. So happy to try to answer anything else if that wasn't the question, but.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, on the second read through the question, I'm wondering whether the question is posed by someone who is served by a municipal utility like Wallingford. And if that's the case, to clarify, the incentives that we are proliferating through the grid modernization proceeding do have eligibility requirements that include being located within the utility service territory of Eversource or UI. Largely because the programs are being funded by ratepayers within those service territories. Additionally, though, what I would like to add here is one thing we didn't have a chance to talk about in the more to come section is please don't forget that we have additional dockets being opened. For example, we just opened 210917. Through which we will be tackling medium and heavy duty fleet incentives in the electrification space, which municipalities will certainly have an interest in as well. So apologize, I think we answered that question two different ways. Hopefully we got to the root of the question. So let's see, we have another question from the Acadia Center, which the danger of referencing stakeholder groups who are leading efforts is I always end up forgetting one. And when I reference that group that I know is leading a coalition on PBR, I mistakenly left out Acadia Center. So my apologies for that. And I am sure there are others. So let me add them to my list of thank yous. And the question is, how can the coalition work with PURA to enhance some of the opening stakeholder efforts to educate. For those that are less familiar with PURA and know that we operate almost exclusively under pretty strict ex parte regulations, meaning that we generally cannot comment or speculate on the outcome of a proceeding outside of a publicly noticed hearing or event. You may be wondering whether you can talk to us about PBR as we're getting going. I am happy to say that the notice of proceeding for that docket noted that we would not be invoking ex parte until the time that we had retained and started work with a consultant. So we are rapidly approaching that point, but if there is interest in discussing how a stakeholder coalition effort could get going in the meantime. That is why we have Taryn O'Connor's contact information on the screen. Thank you for that question. So I know we are 15 minutes over and we still had a handful of questions, but I think we've probably taken up more time than everyone allotted to us this morning. So maybe I'll close with an attempt to offer a wide swipe at the remaining questions. There looks like there's still a lot of interest in what else PURA can do or what else our colleagues at the legislature can do. And I will not speak on their behalf, but I will attempt to offer an answer for PURA and say that hopefully what you understood from today is that we have undertaken in earnest a lot of work, but by no means are the tracks that we have identified an exhaustive list. I've said this elsewhere, there could have easily been hundreds, if not thousands of tracks in grid mod. We recognize that we haven't identified the last of the work, and it's not intended to. So if you are interested in us taking on additional tracks, we're always open for comments. And our movement forward is restricted not by our ambition, but by our practical resources, not just constraints that we face with staffing, but also your time. As I spoke, to come full circle, speaking to what we talked about at the top of the hour, stakeholder fatigue is a very real challenge that I think is not spoken about enough. And with our desire to really emphasize the engagement from non-traditional stakeholders, we want to be cognizant of those limited resources as well. So thank you for being with us today. Please help carry forward the message of what is being done and what's to come. And please stick with us and keep up the engagement and in both our proceedings and in letting us know constructive feedback. So with that, I want to thank you one more time. And we will make available both the slides from today as well as the recording on our website. So thank you very much for attending, and we wish everyone a good rest of the day and a good weekend. Thank you, and we will close.